we've really seen a lot of leaps and bounds in terms of the sophistication that's used and the level of organization. When it comes to equipment, where they taking it, by and large, they're using a lot of stolen equipment, stolen tractors, stolen trailers, and if not, then they're using leased equipment because ownership's not tied to them, right?
Yeah.
When it comes to liquidating, man, that's a tough one. A lot of these folks do seem to be organized. They do seem to be ethnic-based crews, primarily based in Eastern Asia. We've seen, so I don't want to say necessarily that all the cargo's going there. A fair amount of it gets liquidated on like social media marketplaces, e-commerce websites. A lot of it can be done essentially drop shipping, right? If you do strategic theft smartly enough, you never touch the cargo and you collect 100% profit by, say, fraudulently double brokering it to a criminal carrier who's then going to take it to a different destination for you. And it just so happens that different destination is an e-commerce warehouse.
Welcome to the ThinkFreight Podcast. I'm your host, Thomas Werdine, and it's my pleasure to have Danny Ramon. He's the Director of Intelligence at Overhaul. Danny, thank you so much for coming on the show today. It's a pleasure to have you here.
Well, thank you so much, Thomas, for having me. I'm always happy to get on any soapbox that'll have me and spread the gospel of supply chain security.
Absolutely, man. Absolutely. So after this is taking us a couple of takes here at the beginning. I had a couple of tech issues with my camera, so I appreciate Danny's time here. We're running a little bit behind, but Danny, I want to dive right in and kind of talk about who you are and kind of how you got to kind of where you are today. Because I'm sure when you were a kid, you may have not thought you had been working in supply chain intelligence, supply chain and cargo theft. So what were you doing early on, and how did you get to Overhaul?
I had a lot of jobs in my youth. I think as a lot of us did, right? And I grew up along the border, the Texas-Mexico border. So I actually had a fair amount of jobs in warehouses that were logistics related, not necessarily security related. But I've kind of seen I've seen operations from the boots on the ground perspective, which is a unique perspective to have. But then coming through into the overhaul role that I have now, actually started over a decade ago at FreightWatch. And I became what was at the time known as a command and control center representative. They're now known as GSOC operators, right? They're the folks who watch the blips on the map. They're monitoring for compliance. They're monitoring to make sure that the cargo's on the correct route. The driver's doing what he's supposed to be doing, not stopping for too long, not stopping in high risk areas, etc. From there, I went on to management in that role, and pretty quickly got myself into the intelligence department because I think I just have a mind for trends, and I'm pretty twitchy about organizing data. So that helped. But beyond all that, is being in the industry for so long, I've gathered a lot of experience. I've been fortunate enough to know some really incredible people in the industry, and everybody in the industry is so willing to help and promote learning within the industry because we're all on the same team. And you'll hear that from not just me, not just from folks at Overhaul. You'll hear that all over the supply chain security industry, that this is a team sport. It can't be done alone, and everybody is on the same side, right?
Absolutely.
But coming up through that, I've had a lot of military and law enforcement mentors that have taught me a lot about security. And now I'm working with some really great individuals at Overhaul as the Director of Intelligence and Law Enforcement Connect. Law Enforcement Connect is our response team. We are essentially, the guys in the chair when things go wrong. We're getting the information to the people who need it. Of course, we always prefer to prevent because that prevents us from having to get on calls, right?
No, exactly. No, that's really interesting, and I want to dive more into that because I think that the Director of Intelligence part is very interesting because like you said, the data in that side is very important. But I also think that that's very interesting how deeply involved Overhaul is and how deeply you are involved in the transportation, the law enforcement side of things and being part of the incident response team. So, what does that kind of entail and what does that kind of look like from a day-to-day level? Because I know the first time you and I connected, you were definitely getting a lot of, incident responses and law enforcement stuff. So what does that kind of entail and what does that look like on kind of your day-to-day?
Well, yeah, it's really great, like you mentioned, to have both of those perspectives, right? The historical data and then the on the ground, real time intelligence from what we do with LE Connect, which is
Yeah.
communicate with law enforcement across the country, across the globe. The law enforcement professionals who are dealing with the issues that we're dealing with, we're communicating with them. We're seeing, what are they seeing on the ground in their regions, and what can we do to help them? That's a real big part of post event investigations and post-event resolution. Really, if there's any kind of a theft or an attempted theft or any type of fraud perpetrated within your supply chain, uh, really supporting law enforcement is one of the keys to ongoing prevention, right? Because obviously they're the ones who are going to apprehend and help prosecute that criminal.
Absolutely.
So having that an entire department built around supporting law enforcement, not just during an event, giving them live locations and links that they can follow on any device that'll show them exactly where the cargo is and in what condition it's in, but also supporting them after an event with investigations and whatever required paperwork is required from the freight owner to the shipper to the carriers that are involved.
Right.
Sometimes they're also victims of fraud as well. So gathering all of this information, all this intelligence, all of this evidence, providing it to law enforcement is always helpful, and law enforcement always appreciates that. They don't always get extensive support from the private sector when it comes to property crimes, right? A lot of times, once an insurance claim is filed, the private sector company kind of disappears,
Yeah.
because they're in, from their mind, their end is taken care of. They've been compensated for the loss. But from our mind, we really do focus on prevention. That's an ongoing task. So even if someone has been reimbursed for that particular cargo, that's not the entire cost of that loss, just the
Right.
physical property that was taken. So they're still down money. But B, those folks are still out there, and they've successfully gotten away with cargo from customer X. So they think they know how to do it. They're going to continue to try and penetrate that supply chain as often as possible to continue the profit train, right?
No, absolutely. And I was going to say that, that's a great point, because how you guys support law enforcement, it helps really break down some of those barriers to say, like, not to say that law enforcement doesn't know about transportation things, but let's be honest, they've got their hand and their hats in a lot of different arenas. So if you can provide a lot of that data and a lot of insights to say, hey, this is like where things happen, this is exactly, XYZ, and you can really help them kind of piece together, overall what's happening in these kind of crimes in general. It kind of gives them kind of an overall direction, and they can say, okay, like, yes, that we have an idea as to where these potential crimes, or where shops are, or where these districts are of illicit goods, and then they can start following, other leads that they know of, that they've heard of on the street. So it really is a good way to help support law enforcement, also help break down these criminal organizations, and they're not a lot, before, the last 10 years, we saw a lot of these, they were kind of more lower level cargo theft. I'm not going to say that the bigger ones didn't happen. They always have, but we've really seen a massive uptick in these, in these criminal organizations that are targeting very specific freight, high value freight, and really going after, freight is in a higher level, because it is so much more unprotected. I think that I saw, Dan, I think you said you were talking on another medium that before the pandemic, the lowest volume months for cargo theft were usually January and February, and that is no longer the case. Why is that? Why has that changed?
It's changed because of the amount of people who have gotten involved in cargo theft since the pandemic. Prior to the pandemic, we'll call them the good old days, right? Straight theft, which is one of the three main types of cargo theft that we'll talk about in a minute.
Yeah.
Straight theft was the primary type of cargo theft, which is where you essentially there's a process of casing an origin, usually to determine schedules, departure schedules, and things like that, and routes. And then once they've identified a target, a crew, usually between 2 and 4 individuals, is going to follow a tractor trailer that's been targeted from origin, and they're going to wait for it to stop and be left unattended. And then they're going to go in and they're going to take the actual tractor trailer, physically take it from the proper owner, right? That's a straight theft, and then they're going to take it somewhere else. That's just straight up property theft. That was the majority of how cargo theft was performed prior to the pandemic, or at least the majority of reported cargo theft, or what you might even say the majority of cargo theft that mattered, right? Because if it wasn't being reported, it was likely below insurance deductible thresholds, or could have been written up to inventory error, or things like that, right?
Right.
They weren't major losses unless they were full truckload losses. What's happened since the pandemic is we've seen an increase in the other two major types of theft. And actually, one of them started before the pandemic, and that's pilferage. Pilferage is where you literally just open the trailer doors or container doors and take as much as you can. Now, 5, 8, 10 years ago, pilferage used to mean punk kids at a truck stop, right? Popping
Yeah.
seals, hoping to find a video game console, right? And if they found something that was either something they wanted or something that they could pawn, they'd run away with an armload of it. And that was about the extent of it, right? And you can still go to any truck stop in America and just walk the tractor trailer parking lots and just see dozens, if not hundreds, of discarded broken seals on the ground. Those little plastic seals that look like what you peel off the top of a milk jug.
Yep.
Except they have a serial number on them, and they're everywhere in every single truck stop in America. And I guarantee you, there's not a single truck stop in America that's authorized to be a destination point to unload freight, right?
Right.
To see hundreds of discarded and broken seals means that obviously these trailers are getting opened at these locations. Now, pilferage started to increase before the pandemic, but during the pandemic, we started to see a lot of mainstream media news stories about the problem, primarily with rail theft, right? We saw a lot of stories out of Southern California with, just strewn cardboard boxes all over the rail. And there were actually stories of trains that were derailing because of how much trash had just been left that had been unloaded from those rail cars and just left by the tracks. It was actually causing these trains to derail.
Wow.
So that raised awareness, unfortunately, amongst potential criminals across the country. A lot of local area criminals who are already involved in violent crime in their area weren't necessarily involved in cargo theft, but were performing violent and property crimes. They saw this, and if they lived in a major intermodal area, places where cargo's switching from over rail to over the road, or from a cargo ship onto rail, or vice versa, these folks saw not just people on the news stealing all this stuff off of trains, but they saw rail containers and trains sitting idle for days and weeks at a time in their hometown. They started to look at all these distribution centers that had 6-foot chain link fences and had hundreds of trailers behind those fences that would sit there over the entire weekend with maybe one human guard there, and it became a matter of awareness at that point, and they saw that there was an opportunity. They started attacking those opportunities, and they have not seen the level of penalty necessary to deter that action, right? So that's continued to increase. And post-pandemic, what we've seen is people organize around this effort. So where it used to be, again, 10 years ago, punk kids in a truck stop carrying an armload of whatever they could, turned into, 2-3 guys showing up next to the railroad tracks in their Honda Civic and filling up the trunk and back seats of all 3 of those Honda Civics, right? And that's evolved into a dozen guys with 2 or 3 cargo vans or a box truck that they're either leasing or have purchased with their profits. More likely they're leasing and swapping them out, though. And they're bucket brigading entire 53-foot trailers empty in under 10 minutes.
Wow.
And they are, they have no regard for eyewitnesses, CCTV cameras. We've got video. I'm sure if you've been following my LinkedIn page, you've seen some of these videos in the last couple of weeks of thieves operating brazenly in broad daylight, just completely unconcerned, because they know they're planning these things out. They're hitting these rural truck stops. They're going to these rural spots where the trains are stopping, and they know that the response time is going to be longer than they need to complete their entire operation, right? So these folks have absolutely just, it's a problem of lack of penalties, right? They're not being caught often enough, and they're not being prosecuted often enough, because it's really hard to catch them in the act. And especially, if you don't have that proper network, law enforcement network, if you're calling 911 in a major metro area for a property crime, you're on the bottom of the list, and rightfully so. They've got a lot of violent things to respond to. There's bodily harm and personal danger on the line, and those need to be responded to first. But if you have a good law enforcement network of supply chain officers or detectives or those folks who are working specifically with auto or cargo theft, they're not in the 911 queue, right? So you're
Yeah.
not taking away resources from the folks who are responding to that. But we've got dedicated law enforcement professionals all over the country who work 24/7, whether or not their paycheck reflects it, right? And you can call them at 2 o'clock in the morning, and if they are the contact that cares about it, they're going to get up and they're going to go and they're going to see what they can do to stop or help or prevent or apprehend, right? So having that network is great as well.
How are some of these, I guess, and you kind of touched on it a little bit, these organized crime rings that are really doing a lot of these thefts now? How are some of their tactics, getting more brazen in terms of, I guess, what they're doing, but also how are they getting more sophisticated? Because I think, over time we've seen, I think, things morph from a double brokerage model to where we're seeing a ton more of, like you said, the straight theft, the pilferage theft. We're seeing a lot more of those aspects in terms of theft. So, but what about the strategic aspect, and what are we seeing in terms of some of the shifts in some of these organized crime rings and what they're doing? But also, how are they moving some of these goods, Danny? Are they like you said like, they're renting some of these box trucks or buying some of these box trucks, but are they buying semi trucks and are they moving them across the country? Like, are they selling them in the same metro they're stealing them from? How are they doing some of these things?
Yeah. So yeah, fraudulent theft or strategic theft by fraud, that's the third bucket, right? And
Yeah.
Also up. All three buckets are up. Cargo theft is up across the board, right? And
Right.
You don't have to take my word for it. You can read it in a book, right? Like everybody is saying it. All sources are pointing in the same direction. And when it comes to strategic theft and theft by fraud, we've really seen a lot of leaps and bounds in terms of the sophistication that's used and the level of organization. When it comes to equipment, where they taking it, by and large, they're using a lot of stolen equipment, stolen tractors, stolen trailers, and if not, then they're using leased equipment because ownership's not tied to them, right?
Yeah.
When it comes to liquidating, man, that's a tough one. A lot of these folks do seem to be organized. They do seem to be ethnic-based crews, primarily based in Eastern Asia. We've seen, so I don't want to say necessarily that all the cargo's going there. A fair amount of it gets liquidated on like social media marketplaces, e-commerce websites. A lot of it can be done essentially drop shipping, right?
Wow.
If you do strategic theft smartly enough, you never touch the cargo and you collect 100% profit by, say, fraudulently double brokering it to a criminal carrier who's then going to take it to a different destination for you. And it just so happens that different destination is an e-commerce warehouse, right? And they're just going to accept it, scan it into inventory, and start selling it and shipping it. And by the time it shows up there, it's got a different BOL that shows it came from a different origin and maybe even listed as a different kind of freight. So if somebody pulls that over and they don't know exactly what kind of MO they're working with, they're going to see that as, this guy has everything in order and nothing's wrong. Let him go on his way.
Is there any way to, like, I guess, trace down or find, like, in case of some of these, like, electronics, Apple goods, TVs, PS5s, TVs? Is there any way to track some of this stuff down based on, like, serial numbers or anything like that, or is it just kind of lost to the goods when we're selling them through e-commerce and drop shipping and things like that?
Yeah, no. Any electronics that has a unique serial number that gets registered online, computer parts, video game systems, mobile phones, things like that. Yeah, they often do get traced after they're activated. Now, there's no action going to be taken against the end user because the end user is not the criminal, right?
Right.
They usually bought it unaware that it was stolen. But it is used as an investigative tool to determine where these things are going. We do see a fair amount of, especially electronics, going overseas. But that's not to say that all of them go overseas. We do see a fair amount of those electronics get activated stateside as well. So that is used as an investigative tool. Absolutely.
It's interesting. I had a friend. This was about 10 years ago. Who was. He was questioned by the FBI and police because he was buying a large amount of PS5s and Apple goods from what he thought was a legitimate source. They were, a couple $100 underpriced, and he thought he was getting really just solid deals. They were supposed to be open Amazon things, blah blah blah, and it turns out they were all just stolen goods from Amazon. They were stolen goods from cargo theft. and he had no clue at all. He was just buying them, and then he bought like several things for his parents. He bought a couple new TVs. He had like bought a bunch of things for his house. And yeah, come to find out, like they had questioned him for several hours, like, hey, like where'd you buy all this stuff? Like nothing's gonna happen to you. Like we understand, like you had nothing to do with this, but like where'd you find this guy? How'd you find him? Can you give us all of his aliases, his names? How'd you pay him? Like all this other stuff. And they were able to track that guy down. He was working with a larger organization based out of India that were stealing a lot of cargo theft things. And like I said, this was about 10 years ago, but they were stealing large amounts of Apple goods that were going through Amazon. And that's how it was a kind of Amazon return things, Amazon renewed products or things like that they were stealing. And then they were just reselling them extremely cheap online. So yeah, that's extremely interesting that, that's a good way to track them. Now, I guess in what way can some, I guess, freight forwarders, shippers, brokers, carriers, anyone in the supply chain that's touching freight or moving freight, I guess what can they do to, I guess, keep themselves a little bit more safe? And I guess what are some of the tools that they should be, maybe not tools that they should be looking at, but like what kind of data should they be looking at? How can they, I guess, keep themselves just a little bit safer?
Yeah, absolutely. So, again, everyone in the supply chain security industry is going to say the same thing. There is no magic bullet, right? There's no
Yeah,
one thing that you can do that's going to that's going to secure your supply chain. It is a team sport, and security is a culture, right? So you have to build that culture from the bottom up. And one of the things I tell like origin facilities when we're trying to train them on the red flags to look for that indicate potential fraud when a
yeah,
driver or tractor or trailer come in through the gates, is that if security is everybody's job, it's nobody's job, right? Because everybody has a whole other job already. So a
right,
dedicated security person is absolutely necessary if you're concerned about that kind of thing, right? Everybody also has a different risk tolerance. So it's going to, different measures that you're going to take are going to depend on that risk tolerance and also your risk profile. So everybody's supply chain is absolutely unique. Even if you're within the same, industry vertical and within the same geographic area, everybody's supply chain is unique. That
yeah,
being said, the one thing that everybody should do is get plugged in to the industry. Uh, Build a network, not just of law enforcement, but of industry professionals, because, like I mentioned, it's a team sport and everybody's on the same side.
yeah,
There's not a single person that I've met in this industry that's not willing to help another person in this industry, regardless of what company you work for, what carrier you work for, or
yeah.
anything else of that matter. We are all on the same side. We all realize that if we can capture more of these bad guys and put them away, we're all going to spend less time on the phone at 3 o'clock in the morning.
Yeah, you're spot on. I know some people that just quick aside. I have a broker friend that was actually double brokered. He did a ton of due diligence, everything checked out. And what had happened was when he had found out he had been double brokered, he had actually, long story short, got through all the BOLs, found the actual carrier that moved it, and in turn he didn't find his load that day, but he actually found another broker's load from his same customer that had also got double brokered. So he called him and was like, hey, like I found your load. I'm sure you were looking for it. And the guy was doing the same thing, trying to find the load. And I think that guy actually ended up finding my friend's load, Jason's load. So it goes to show, just like you said, we're all willing to help. We're all willing to do whatever it takes to help stop these double brokers, these criminals, these fraudsters, whoever they are, wherever, whatever they're doing from any aspect of fraud and double brokering and theft. We're all willing to go above and beyond and help.
Yeah, and it's actually not uncommon, especially with strategic thefts, fraudulent thefts, to find a whole mess of them all at once, right? Because these guys are trying to perform as many thefts as they can in rapid succession before whatever particular method they're using gets discovered and shut down, right?
Right.
So a couple of years ago, 2.5 years ago, I want to say, it was my first year here at Overhaul, and we actually, working with a client, were able to set up a sting operation and recovered not only 3 of that client's trailer loads of cargo, but during that operation, we also found a full trailer load of another victim's cargo that wasn't even our client.
Wow.
But because of the industry being the way the industry is, we all immediately knew this is stolen. we all
Yep.
immediately also knew who to call and say, hey, guess what? We found your cargo. Um,
It's just crazy how that works, and like you said, that they're always trying to get through or get as many loads or shipments or double broker loads, whatever it is. They're trying to get through as many as possible because whatever method they're doing, if they're using different MCs, if they're using different strategic ways, eventually they're going to get caught and they're going to get found out and they're going to have to run to a different alias, run to a different phone system, all these different things, and that takes a little bit of time, takes a little bit of money and effort, and they don't want to go through that. If they can use these bad aliases as long as possible. I mean, I've seen plenty of times where brokers see, hey, a couple of double brokering reports or theft reports from 300 days ago, and they say, oh, maybe this was the bad actor lie and say, hey, like we had an issue, we had our MC stolen, blah blah blah, and then they just go on another whole another run of 30 days of theft, and it just kind of repeats the whole cycle. You know what I mean?
yeah, absolutely. And these guys are bright, they're intelligent, and
Yes.
they know the industry because they've operated in the industry for years, if not decades, right? So they
Yeah.
already know how it works, they know how to get around things. In a lot of cases, they've got their next step planned already because they know what security countermeasures you have in place, right?
Right.
And if they don't know, if you're not telling them, they have ways to find out. It's essentially penetration testing, right?
Oh
Uh,
yeah.
yeah, and they're gonna figure out based on what security countermeasures you have in place, what level of fraud they need to commit to get around your system, right? And we've
Yeah.
seen them. I've talked to people who were not clients who then became clients and said, oh well, at this time when we were experiencing in our network much higher levels of sophistication, they were experiencing from what appeared to be the same actors much lower levels of sophistication. And then when they, when they started getting our services onboarded, we saw the next level of sophistication try to kick in. But because we'd already seen that, we were able to prevent it, right? But they absolutely know what schemes will work on what shippers and what locations, and they'll go through the entire ladder of progression until they've worn it out, and then they'll go on to the next low hanging fruit.
No, exactly. So, Danny, I want to dive into kind of some of the numbers from last year, and then a little bit more about as we get a little bit closer to a couple of disruptive events with the Olympics starting, as well as 4th of July upcoming. I want to kind of set the stage. So, in 2023, there were 1,183 reports of cargo thefts, each averaging a loss of around $586,000 for a total of $694 million in stolen goods. Now, that is according to a report that was released from Overhaul for the 2023 year. Now, the average loss per theft of shipment represents a 67% increase over the average of 351,000 in 2022. And you guys expected that volume to increase another 35% in 2024. And looking at the trends, I mean, from Q1 of 2023 to Q1 of 2024, there was a 38% increase in cargo thefts. It seems like we're definitely on track in 2024 for another really terrible year of cargo theft and strategic thefts. Why do you think that I guess brokers, shippers, why do you think we're not getting better at protecting our freight?
I think, by and large, we are getting better at protecting our freight, but the rate of acceleration of our improvement is outpaced by the rate of acceleration of the criminals, and the rate at which they're increasing in being able to improve their targeting methods, and the fact that they are now performing thefts in rashes. Like I mentioned, they are performing,
Yeah.
instead of doing one at a time, they're doing a half dozen to a dozen to a couple dozen at a time. So that happening is increasing both the volume and the value, right?
Yeah.
Now, one thing I want to talk about when we talk about average value is that's only the value of the cargo. That's not the
Right.
value of any conveyance that was stolen. That's not the value of any restocking costs. That's not the value of any brand damage. That's not the value of any market loss because your product is not on the shelves. So that's all that is. But also, it's all self-reported, just like all cargo theft data in the United States. It's all voluntarily reported, right? And we've made great strides as an industry in convincing people to report more, But one of the old things that is still being held on to that people are still embarrassed to report is the value on very high value loads. So
Yeah.
not only is that self-reported, but that's and not only is that just the property value of the cargo itself, that's also a low estimate because that is essentially extrapolated from the average value of those that are reported. And last time I
Right.
checked, so please don't quote me on this, but we're floating somewhere, it's below 50% of theft incidents come with a reported value.
Wow.
And also, there's no standard of what that reported value is. Is that the manufacturing cost? Is that the wholesale value? Is that the retail cost? Most times when we get a value reported to us, we don't get any kind of qualifier with it of what that value is quantified as, right?
Right.
So it could be retail value. More than likely, it's one of those steps below that. But also, so chances are the actual value is even higher than that reported value. And then you take into account all the thefts that don't have a reported value. By and large, those skew into the industries that are very cost dense: pharmaceuticals,
Mm,
electronics, high end designer apparel and footwear. Those are the ones that have lower overall percentages of value reporting to begin with. So that value, while impressive, is likely an order of magnitude less than the true value.
yeah. Yeah. No, that's spot on. And just by Overhaul's data, it looks like pharmaceuticals are roughly 5% of what is reported. And clothing and shoes is right around 13%, while electronics is right around 23%. So we do. So I'm sure that pharmaceuticals, I'm sure that a lot of those potentially go unreported, or even potentially are very under rate or undervalued in terms of what they're telling, or if they're even putting values.
Yeah. Value perhaps, but pharma's got to be the best reporting industry that we have, right?
That's awesome. Yeah.
It really is. They are the tip of the spear. They're the canary in the coal mine. They're the ones who are willing to try out new techniques for security, and it's because they've got their risk tolerance is much, much lower. Not only is it
Interesting.
highly cost dense, right? Pills are tiny
Right.
and expensive. It's highly regulated, and chain of custody is such a big deal for pharma. If they
Mm,
lose if they lose one tractor trailer full of prescription medication X, right, and they get it back, awesome. They have to send that tractor trailer of product X to be burned and destroyed. It has to be
yeah.
incinerated because it was not within their chain of custody the entire time, right?
Right.
If they don't get it back, they have to recall the entire lot number or batch number, which could be up to 10 or 12 other tractor trailers full of product. And they all
Wow.
have to be destroyed because recalls work by batch number, not by
Mm,
whatever was on that trailer, right?
right.
So the entire batch number has to be recalled. So their risk tolerance is much, much, much lower. I believe that we hear about 100% of the pharmaceutical cargo thefts that happen in the United States, and I think that they are unique in that regard. Maybe
That's awesome.
95%. But by and large, if there's a pharmaceutical cargo theft, we hear about it, and they are very proactive in terms of promoting intelligence and information sharing and best practices. One of the leading information sharing organizations in our industry is spearheaded by the pharma industry. Is called the Pharmaceutical Cargo Security Coalition. And
Wow.
if anybody who's in the industry who has not heard of it, I urge you at once to go join PCSC, which is run by the HDA Healthcare Distribution Alliance, I believe.
Yep.
Chuck Forsyth on LinkedIn, he heads up the PCSC. Fantastic contact.
Who would you say? What industry would you say is the least secure, or not maybe secure, but in terms of reporting
Oh,
cargo theft and fraud?
you're going to ask me to put someone on blast. I see. Okay. No, I would say by and large, and it's weird because they're the flip side of the pharma coin in terms of tightly regulated. But I'll tell you, every time I'm presenting cargo theft data to anyone in the tobacco industry, I feel like they know a lot more than I do. Uh, and I've essentially told them that, and they've kind of chuckled and nodded at me. So I know that the tobacco industry keeps their cards pretty close to the chest.
Mm,
Uh, I know that the numbers that we have that the industry has for tobacco thefts is much lower than what actually happens, but we do by and large have an accurate enough cross section to figure out what's going on in that vertical.
how do you think that some of these overall thefts? I mean, we're talking reported numbers of almost 700 million. And like we said, that's probably 25, maybe 20%, 25%, 30%. How do you think that some of these fraud and theft numbers impact overall inflation in terms of what we're seeing over the last couple of years, as well as, going into COVID, we saw a huge run up of rates. And I think that these are two things that really go untalked about, is the massive, rate increases we saw over that time, as well as the massive increase in strategic and overall thefts.
Yeah. That's a great point, and something that I've often wondered and worried and posted about myself. Actually, I think I posted
Yeah.
an article very recently that the first study that I'm aware of has actually tied an increase in consumer prices to cargo theft, and it was just for food and beverage and just in Mexico, and the increase in consumer cost was just under 8%.
Wow.
Which, when you consider how low margin grocery items typically are, I think the average margin, wall to wall in a grocery store is somewhere just under 3%. That's probably one of the lowest margin verticals, and in an area where they're not necessarily going to be charging as much as they could for it.
Yeah.
8% for food and drink in Mexico makes me think that, consumer prices are going up by 15-20% for electronics in the United States. I mean, this is finger in the air calculations, but this is the first scholarly study I've seen done on this subject. So it's, it's a little tough to draw global conclusions from that, but we know that it's going to be higher than 8%, if that's what it shows for food and beverage in Mexico. So,
do you think that, some of the regulation that we've seen proposed over the last month or so, do you think that's going to help at all, or is it just kind of maybe blowing smoke in the wind, and it's, we don't really have a good, in terms of an enforcement agency like the FMCSA can't do a ton in terms of, in terms of what they're doing with double brokers. I mean, they're really a small agency. I think less than 1,200 people, or less than a lot of agencies. And I know that some of their overall initiatives lately have been, trying to push to stop double brokers and identity theft issues. But do you think some of these overall cargo theft initiatives that we're seeing come up in Congress, do you think that anything like that is going to help?
It is, right? Because anything's going to help, even if it only helps raise awareness, which I think it will do more than that. But even if that's all it did, it would be helpful. Because it will close holes of certain MOs and methods that are used today for strategic and fraudulent theft, that we have seen, historically, do cyclically come back around. We've seen some of the most basic forms of strategic or fraudulent theft practiced this year, just because they know that it can be done and they're going to get away with it, and that certain low-hanging fruit is vulnerable to those types of MOs. So what's likely going to happen is that they will close some of the loopholes by which fraud is being performed today. But by the time they do that, there will likely be new types of fraud, right? Does that mean that we shouldn't do it? No, we should absolutely shut down the types of fraud that we can. But what I'm hoping they do, and it's unknown at this point what exactly is going to be done, what I'm hoping they do is that they empower the private sector and those who are driven enough to actually want to do this, that they're going to provide the data to us to be able to vet carriers properly, to be able to spot fraud in the supply chain in a timely manner. Right now, FMCSA and DOT websites for carrier information, there's a 30-day lag once information is submitted until it gets updated on that website. And that's not even counting the lag of actually the process of updating the information. So, when you think about how many loads a fraudulent carrier can get away with in a 30-day window, and like you mentioned, if they then come up with a story that explains that away and then they get another 30-day window, man, that's a lot of shipments. That's driving up the average value. That's driving up the volume of cargo thefts in the country. And it's incredibly hard to apprehend and prosecute some of these folks with these strategic thefts, especially when they're using they're fraudulently double and triple brokering to legitimate carriers who have no idea that they're involved in the theft, right? And if they're bearing the vulnerability, and if they get caught, they're not only are they probably not going to get paid for the leg of the journey that they carried, but they're also going to be in the middle of a police investigation for all their trouble.
We talked about raising awareness, but do you think that could, on the flip side, in turn, create more criminals like we saw, early on in the pandemic?
Depends on the type of theft, right? Pilferage requires no special knowledge other than, I see a trailer there and it's been there for 3 days. It requires no special skill or know-how. Fraudulent theft does require, I don't want to call it a minimum, but a baseline of industry knowledge, right? And at least a baseline of technical knowledge as well, because a lot of these are performed with the aid of technology. But it's going to be tough, and a lot of things have to be done. But what I think with strategic theft in particular, the awareness is going to benefit more than hinder the industry, because it's going to drive more security awareness initiatives, especially for a lot of the owner operator carriers who, if you're an owner operator, if you're a one-man company, you don't have an HR department, you don't have an IT department, nobody's pushing cybersecurity training at you, nobody's making you take a phishing awareness training program, right? But if these things start becoming more commonplace, if this becomes the culture of the supply chain, as I think it should, then maybe brokers will require their carriers to take these courses and make sure that their identity is not going to be stolen, that they're not going to fall victim to a scam email asking them to go to a fake website and enter in their USDOT username, password, PIN, right? Which is a thing that happens frequently today.
Very frequently, yeah.
So, and a lot of times that person who put that in on the bogus website doesn't even know they're a victim until they get a call from a police department saying, hey, we think your carrier was involved in this theft. And we're like, I don't even operate in California. What's going on?
Right. And, the other time I see, there's 2 times I see when carriers, start to realize that they're a victim is that instance there, or when they start to go to call brokers to book loads, and they can no longer book loads because their MC is tainted with Carrier 411 or with bad reviews. They've been blacklisted because they've got 7 new claims of theft or double brokering, triple brokering, and that's when they start to realize. I've seen it happen time and time again. I'm in a lot of Facebook groups, and I see, hey guys, I can't book loads with so and so broker because they say I'm double brokering. I've never double brokered. I'm just a one-man team, blah, blah, blah. I only operate in the Midwest, and it's saying I'm doing things in California, which is like saying California. And yeah, it's a nauseating cycle that just continuously happens. And, these owner ops are just trying to do the right thing. They're saying, hey, something's happening on DAT. I've got a bad review, or this happened or that happened, or hey, I've got to do this with the FMCSA, or I'm going to, or be, out of service, or whatever it may be. And it's just, they prey on the busyness of the owner operators. When you're driving 11 and a half hours a day and you're stopping at a truck stop to use the restroom, and you see one of these emails, you may just, click it real fast as you're walking through the bathroom, or walking to the bathroom, or out. And it may just be a second thought as to, is this real or fake? So,
and it's tough for the FMCSA to deal with because, like you mentioned, they're a regulatory agency. They're not an enforcement agency, right? There's no one in the FMCSA who has a badge who's going to go out and start tapping on, drivers' windows and saying, hey, you better cut that out. Like, that doesn't happen. It's not what they were made for. They're trying to, encroach into that space because they have to at this point, right? But there's no FMCSA field agents, like I said, with a badge going out there and shaking a finger and saying, stop it.
I want to talk about, Danny, disruptive events, as the Olympics is right here on our heels. We also have the 4th of July just creeping up. As a lot of people in the industry say, and something that Overhaul really prides itself on saying and believes in, is cargo at rest is cargo at risk. So why don't we talk a little bit about some of these disruptive events and how criminals tend to kind of look at these events and target them a little bit more, and why these 4th of July's, Olympics, Christmas time, things like that, why they tend to be a little bit more targeted events.
Yeah. Well, for holidays, 4th of July coming up, right? Cargo at rest is cargo at risk. Can't steal cargo if it's moving unless you're stealing it strategically. But by and large, that usually leads into extended weekends. And truckers, they don't get a lot of time at home. If they're able to schedule a long weekend somewhere near their home, they're going to stage their truck. They're going to go home. They're going to spend time with their family, understandably. But that does lead to risk, right? If the cargo is going to be stationary and unattended for an extended period of time, that's exposing it to unnecessary risk. So we always like to make sure everybody's aware and checks the schedules, the shipping and receiving schedules. Make sure you're checking the schedules of your receiving facilities. Particularly around this
Right.
year, 4th of July falls on a Thursday, right?
Yep.
Some places might be closed on Friday or might be on a skeleton crew on Friday and might not be able to accept the delivery on Friday, which means that shipment's going to have to sit over the weekend before it gets accepted.
Right.
That obviously creates vulnerabilities, right? When we talk about events, and this is holidays and events, it's a capacity issue, right? When we look at events like the Olympics, everybody's working on construction to increase capacity for tourists, for people. Nobody's increasing supply chain capacity. Nobody's increasing storage capacity. Nobody's increasing parking capacity, right? Not for tractor trailers. So that, and also there's police capacity, right? They're going to be patrolling all the very populated areas. They're going to be worried about tourist safety. They're going to be worried about all sorts of other things rather than supply chain security, which, to be quite frank, it's not like that's part of their checklist every day anyways. But quite a bit more of their manpower is going to be dedicated towards all these special events that are going on. Unfortunately, an analogous event would be the riots, I think about a year ago in Memphis, right? Memphis has a very well-known industrial district going southeast from Memphis, Lamar Avenue. A lot of the big-name distribution and receiving facilities are along Lamar Avenue, and it's a very notorious area for cargo theft. During those riots in Memphis, there was a huge rash of pilferages along Lamar Avenue, large-scale pilferages, because the criminals knew exactly what was going to happen. The entire Metro Police Force was going to be mobilized for crowd control, and riot suppression, right? Rightfully so, but that creates vulnerabilities. And at that point, protection of the cargo is on the individual company. Excuse me, it's not on the police to protect your cargo at that point. So, knowing what your vulnerabilities are, knowing what would make you the low-hanging fruit and eliminating those factors is really key. And being able to identify those before they happen is really the only way to mitigate those risks effectively.
As we kind of come up on time here, Danny, I want to ask you kind of one more quick one, which I think is kind of fun and a little bit more lighthearted in terms of what we've been talking about. It's been very deep in terms of cargo theft and cargo fraud. It's very important, but I think this will be a little bit more fun. So, as we're right here at the crux of June, coming into July. What are you most bullish on for the rest of 2024, and where do you think, I guess, the supply chain and cargo theft is trending? Do you think we're heading in a better direction with some of these disruptive events and some of these, regulations that may be coming down the pipeline as well?
Yeah. If I had to sum it up in like one catchy little soundbite, it's gonna get worse before it gets better. I think overall we're heading in the right direction with awareness, with industry participation. I've attended the TAPA T1 conference in Dallas for the past 3 years, and every year has been a record-breaking attendance for the last 3 years, to the point that the most recent one was at capacity. They had to turn away people who were hoping to register the last couple of weeks of that event because they were at capacity. So that means we're going to have to find a new venue, right? But that's a good thing, because that means the industry is not only aware, but they're actively participating in security, which is what's going to be needed. Like I mentioned, though, the rate of acceleration for the sophistication of the criminals is currently outpacing the increase in security on the industry side. So I'd like to see that speed up a little bit more and overtake the rate of acceleration for the criminals. And I think at that point, we'll start to see some really good returns. And I mean, we're already seeing really good returns in our network, but we're dealing with ultra low risk tolerance, tip of the spear folks who are willing to dedicate resources to security,
Absolutely.
Yeah.
No, absolutely. Danny, I want to thank you again, for coming on the show, spending some time talking about cargo thefts and kind of what you guys are seeing over at Overhaul. If our audience wants to get in touch, or they want to learn more, or have, want to be part of the tip of the spear and help, report some of these cargo thefts, how can they find you and how can they find Overhaul online?
Yeah, absolutely. First, great first step is to follow me on LinkedIn, Danny Ramon of Overhaul. I think I'm pretty easy to find. You can
Absolutely.
always email me directly, danny.ramon@over-hall.com if you want to just reach out directly. But you can also just check out our website, over-hall.com, to kind of see what we have in terms of a suite of products that might be able to help you. They're not all necessarily security focused. I work in the security arm of what we do, but we've got a lot of visibility products, insurtech products that are going to help with mitigate some of your insurance costs, and some fantastic cold chain products as well. So we really have a full suite of products available for supply chain visibility. But of course, I'm pretty partial to our security solutions.
Make sure you guys check out Danny and Overhaul. We'll have all the links in the comments. If you guys like today's podcast, make sure you give it a like and review. It helps us out a ton. And don't forget, we do drop newsletters 3 times a week, Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at thinkfreight.io. We'll catch you guys in the next episode, and don't forget to think freight.